Hello again, it's Mrs. Fenton from Stevenson High School in Lincolnshire, Illinois. Welcome again, happy Monday, and we're getting ready today to start Unit 1. These daily lessons will be 25 to 45 minutes long, and we're going to continue them all the way through May 1st. So here is your overview of the curriculum, and the last 3 days, so last week, we talked about clinical psychology. And we're going to save social psychology till the end. So we're going to start right now with Unit 1 and work our way through each of the first 7 units. And then at the end, we'll do a little bit of material with Unit 9. So today, we're going to go over the general considerations that are part of FRQs, as well as a review of SOTAs. We're going to review the practice that I gave you on Friday and talk about the historic and contemporary approaches in psychology. So here's SOTAs again with your FRQs. You want no intros, no conclusions, no thesis statement. These are not really an essay. You're going to want to space out your answer, leave a little bit of blank lines between each concept. So if you have to go back and add, you can. Answer in order, include a definition, apply to the scenario, and check for synonyms. Now you will notice at the beginning of an FRQ that there's often an FRQ rubric. But there's what we call general considerations. And some of these are also on the test, right, when you're taking it. And the first thing I want to point out is this term cogent. So cogent just means that you need to be clear. Your answer needs to be clear and convincing. If it's occasionally, it's like a run-on or a fragment, that's not going to be penalized. Same thing with spelling. As long as the spelling is close enough where the reader, the grading individual, the teacher, and tell what you mean, it's fine. So do not worry about spelling or grammar. This is what I've shown you a little bit before. So definitions alone do not score, but they can be used to enhance an application. So if your application, your A in SOTAs, is maybe a little bit incomplete, it's missing a piece, but that missing piece is present in the definition, it's going to score. So the definitions are really to your benefit. Rubric examples provided are not exhaustive. So even when I give you a rubric, it doesn't mean that if your answer isn't exactly like the one I put up on the screen, that it wouldn't score. So that's something that maybe you could ask your teacher because it's not completely exhaustive. This is something directly in the general considerations where it's telling you that if you parrot or repeat the terms directly, that it's not going to score. And that's why we have the S in SOTAs for synonyms. So observational learning is learning by observing. Any version of that alone is not good. You can use the word as long as you also explain it or use a synonym to explain it. Next up, you're not going to be penalized for misinformation unless it directly contradicts. So if you have something that's just wrong, but it's not a direct contradiction, for example, you could say, if you said that the hippocampus is in charge of encoding new long-term memories, and then you said it's not related to memory, that would be a direct contradiction. But if you said something true about the hippocampus and maybe you added something else that's a little bit wrong, that would just be ignored. Also, another benefit to SOTAs, a correct application with an incorrect definition is not a direct contradiction, and that's going to score. So the definition doesn't really hurt you, it only helps you. Response only scores if it's clearly indicating what part of the question you're doing. So if you don't use the term directly at the beginning of your response and you answer your questions out of order, then it might not be recognized as what you're talking about. So that order piece in SOTAs is very important. Okay, I'm going to give you a moment to look at the FRQ that I gave you on Friday. A little bit more difficult, a little bit more nuanced. For those of you just joining us today, I'll give you a moment to read. And this one also had a graph with it. So these two different graphs. The first one, variable 1, and the second one, variable 2. For part A, the first one was to indicate which neurotransmitter is being measured and why. And the correct answer here is going to be dopamine. So I listed several of dopamine's functions, and you would not need to list all of them, but you're definitely going to want to make the point that dopamine is related to schizophrenia. And that's what we call the dopamine hypothesis. So high levels of dopamine are correlated to schizophrenia. Dopamine in low levels, you might remember, is sometimes related to Parkinson's disease. And we did talk a little bit about glutamate in terms of schizophrenia on Friday, and it's believed to be potentially involved, but it's hard to make it exactly fit with this chart, right, with neurotransmitter levels. So you're going to want to probably use dopamine. I brought up glutamate because I was trying to bring up, some more neurotransmitters for review. The next part of part A said that you needed to describe the relationship between the neurotransmitter level and the number of positive symptoms. So in this case, the positive symptoms, you want to describe them first, give a definition. And then you might say, according to the data, there's a positive relationship between the level of neurotransmitters and the number of positive symptoms. So that means that the variables are moving in the same direction, right? So as one goes up, the other goes up. As one goes down, the other goes down. So you want to make this reference to the correlation that can be seen in the data. For part B, identify the independent variable or variables in the study. And those are the factors in a study, you might recall, that are being manipulated. So sometimes when people think about a hypothesis, they put it into an if-then statement. If you take these medications, then your symptoms will be decreased, right? So the if, the first part, whatever comes after that is the independent variable. So if you take medication, the independent variable is the medication or the new drug, then your symptoms will decrease. So the dependent variable is going to be those symptoms in that particular statement. So this, the dependent variable is the factor being measured, right? In this study, the dependent variables are the level of the neurotransmitters, that's variable 1, and the number of positive symptoms, that's variable 2. When you have a dependent variable, you also want to always remember to operationally define it. So you could say the number of positive symptoms from 0 to 30. The more specific you are, the better. Okay, this next one, it says, explain why the study was not a true experiment. So this is a part in SOTAs where it can get a little strange. You could define experiment and then apply it, but this is a direct question, so you could probably just go ahead with the application and answer it. But I provided you a definition here because, again, we're reviewing. So what you want to point out here is that this is not an experiment because there's no random assignment. The participants weren't placed by chance into either the control or experimental groups. In fact, there isn't a control group. So this is not experimental research. So again, here's some general tips for free response questions, and you want to basically practice every time you're doing one, remembering SOTAs. All right, we are back at the beginning of the year with topic 1.1, Introducing Psychology. So this is about the philosophical and physiological perspectives that created psychology as a science. And we're going to talk about the early approaches and the contemporary approaches. Just a reminder, if you need a definition, you can hit up apadictionary.com or dictionary.apa.org. And the Brain Facts is a fantastic site to view a 3D brain and learn some information about neurotransmitters and brain structures. So we're going to start, because it's the beginning, with a definition of psychology. So psychology studies behaviors and mental processes. But the earliest approaches in psychology focus mainly on that mental processes piece. And what psychology is built upon are these kind of two existing disciplines, physiology and philosophy. So with philosophy, you're talking about the rational, methodical study of the nature of like knowledge or reality or human existence. And it goes back, thousands of years. It's a key part, a key element in human intellectual history. And physiology is an aspect of biology, which is the study of living animals, which would include organs, anatomy, cells, biological compounds, and how they kind of combine to make life. So psychology is kind of built on these two fields. Okay, so these are the early theoretical approaches or schools of thought. And remember I told you that the terms approaches and perspectives and schools of thought are all kind of interchangeable. You don't have to, there's no distinction. So it depends on the textbook that maybe you're reading. You might use the term approaches or perspectives. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to refer to these four right here on the screen as schools of thought. These are the earliest approaches in psychology. So I think of them as schools of thought or old school. And we'll look at the 7 contemporary perspectives as kind of new school. But the old school would be these 4. And the first one is structuralism. And structuralism is this early approach that was looking at consciousness, looking at thought, and trying to break it down into its elemental pieces. So those elements or building blocks are what they called structures. That's the structures in structuralism. And this is occurring, you know, at a time you have these other fields that are kind of creating these elements. Notably, chemistry creates the periodic table of the elements, where they break down matter into its like smallest elements. So this is an attempt, an early attempt to kind of break down consciousness into its essentially elements or structures. And the process that they used, the research technique, was introspection. Having subjects reflect on their current state, they might be exposed to a loud noise or a ball dropping onto a table, and they would be asked to identify when they heard it and when they realized they heard it. So there's a lot of problems with introspection, subjects giving different reports about the same stimulus, subjects about the same stimulus changing from trial to trial or day to day. And it's really hard to use to study complex things like learning. So structuralism, which is based on introspection, is going to be challenged by our next school of thought. But first, I want to introduce you to the individual who's kind of the beginnings of structuralism, Ilhan Bunte. And he used introspection, and he is considered sometimes the founder of psychology, because he's combining those two fields we mentioned, physiology and philosophy, and using scientific methods, and it's kind of the birth of psychology. There's a number of influential graduate students, including Tichenor, who brought structuralism to the United States. So functionalism is that next approach. And instead of trying to identify the elements that make up consciousness, like the components, they're looking at the evolved purposes of those elements, right? So this is a theory that's kind of overlapping with evolution. And our key functionalist individual is William James, and that is my favorite William James picture. He also wrote the first psychology textbook. And he famously said that the first lecture in psychology that he ever heard was the one he gave. His textbook and his philosophy was to make psychology relevant to people's lives. And he said that you couldn't identify the structures or the elements of consciousness, because consciousness was like a stream of like ever-changing sensations, and it couldn't be broken down to these stable components. So this is a approach for early school of thought that is opposing structuralism. The next early school of thought is called Gestalt, and you might remember them when we were in sensation and perception. We talked about Gestalt principles of grouping, so proximity, similarity, continuity, and we'll talk about that again when we get to sensation and perception. These people looked at consciousness and said we shouldn't look at the structures or the elements that make it up, or even the evolved functions of these elements, that we should instead focus on the whole, the bigger picture, because the whole of consciousness would be greater, more important than the sum of its parts and the structures. There is no need to associate a name with Gestalt, but if you're looking for one, you could use Max Wertheimer. And then I'm going to go ahead and put Freud in this early schools area, and psychodynamic, the more modern version of his theory, with the contemporary approaches or schools. So this is also based on consciousness and thought. But Freud was primarily a therapist or a clinician, and he did a lot of his work based on case studies. So if you look at the four early schools all next to each other, you are all generally studying consciousness. Structuralism, identifying the basic elements. Functionalism, the evolved purposes of those elements that make up thought, greatly influenced by Charles Darwin. Gestalt, considering thought as an organized whole, and then Freud as the practitioner and unconscious thought influencing behavior. Okay, let's take a short break for a check for understanding. I'll give you 3 examples here. So for each of these examples, you're going to choose one of the early schools of thought. And let's see how you did. With example 1, you should have functionalism. That's what those evolved purposes, that's what functions are, purposes. The second one, Gestalt, and the third one, structuralism. That brings us to the modern approaches. So the 7 kind of modern approaches are psychodynamic, which is the updated version of Freud's theory, behavioral, humanistic, cognitive, biological, evolutionary, and sociocultural. And then we also have this idea of a biopsychosocial approach, which is saying that basically behaviors and mental processes are best explained if you are able to combine 2 or more of these approaches to describe really complex behaviors. I'm going to give you a little tip here. If you have an FRQ related to an approach, you want to start by referencing the definition of psychology, so the scientific study of the behavior and mental processes of organisms, and then incorporate the important vocabulary from that particular discipline, that particular perspective or approach. So you can kind of use this fill in the blank as your intro to define any of the 7 perspectives. So psychodynamic, behaviors and mental processes, here we are with that definition of psychology, are based on a modern interpretation of Freud's ideas. Behaviors are influenced by unconscious motivations, potentially by issues within the personality, the ego's ability to kind of mediate the demands of the id and the superego. And you should recognize these 3 individuals, probably from the personality, or with Erickson, potentially the development unit. But these are all psychodynamic approaches. Next one is what we're going to refer to as the early behaviorism approach. So this theory explains that behaviors are learned through association. And these are the individuals that you might remember from the learning unit. So people like Pavlov, Watson, Skinner, all of these people were influential in the early behaviorist approach. Someone like Bandura is a little bit different. We call him social cognitive theory because he is including cognitive or thought process, whereas these true early behaviorists like Watson and Skinner, they felt that psychology should only be the study of observable and measurable actions, which would be a major departure from structuralism, functionalism, Gestalt, and even psychoanalytic, which focus much more on the consciousness piece. Modern psychology, of course, combines both cognition and behavior. So just a little flashback to the learning unit. So here we have the experiments with little Albert. And in this little Albert study, Watson built association. So he created a fear in a young child to a previously neutral item. So why don't you take a second and try to fill in those components of classical conditioning. With classical conditioning, it's usually easiest to start with the two responses. They both will be the same or similar, the unconditioned response and the conditioned response, and they both have to be involuntary. So for both of those, you're going to see I put them in blue to highlight that they're going to be the same or really similar. So fear. Now, the conditioned response sometimes might be a little bit weaker than the unconditioned response, but they're going to be the same or similar. The neutral stimulus and the conditioned stimulus are going to be the same as well, as long as learning occurred. So this initially neutral stimulus that did nothing, the little Albert, the white rat, because it was paired with the unconditioned stimulus, the loud noise, the boy, the little Albert, learned to fear conditioned stimulus, learned stimulus, the white rat. Our next perspective is the humanistic approach. And the key individuals here are Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, who you would have probably most likely seen in your personality unit. But they also appear in the clinical unit as well, because they have an approach to therapy. So with Maslow, those kind of key concepts that you're going to want to try to apply with any kind of behavior are the hierarchy of needs. With Rogers, potentially it's this need for acceptance, which is unconditional positive regard, genuine and honesty, and that could be between a person and maybe a therapist, but also being genuine and honest with yourself. The humanistic approach is a departure from the behaviorist approach, because they're going to really emphasize free will and the ability that individuals have to control their behavior, and not really just being a collection of stimulus response associations. And humanistic approach emerged when behaviorism and psychoanalytic theory were dominating psychology. And so sometimes it's referred to as the third force. And we have this period where the behaviorist approach is really dominant, the early behaviorist approach. And then we have a kind of a turn as we go back and we move into the cognitive approach. This theory says that behaviors and mental processes are influenced by thoughts, attitudes, memories, expectations. They would study things like memory, creativity, language, intelligence. And the cognitive approach would argue that we actually do have the ability, we do have tools to scientifically investigate thought. And some key individuals, of course, we had Ellis and Beck with cognitive therapy, but Jean Piaget from the development unit, he was someone who was approaching the development in children of cognitive abilities in a stage theory. The biological approach. So with the biological approach, behaviors and mental processes are influenced by changes in the nervous system. So differences in behavior might be due to neurotransmitter imbalances. So at the beginning, we talked about schizophrenia, and those changes in thought and movement and behavior may be a result of something like excessive dopamine. Hormones, nervous system activity also impact behavior, and certainly genes inherited from one's parents. So we talked in the clinical unit about the heritability of schizophrenia and certain other conditions. There's a lot of key individuals that you can look at with the biological approach, but Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga both did work on lateralization of function with like split brain research. And to give you a couple names for biological. Next up, we have the evolutionary approach. And anytime you're talking about the evolutionary approach, you're going to want to try to work in the phrase natural selection. So behaviors and mental processes that are present today exist because early humans who had those behaviors or mental processes had a survival advantage, potentially. And therefore, they were naturally selected and they were continuing today. So this is an aspect of Darwin's theory that inherited characteristics provide adaptive survival advantages and are more likely to get passed on to subsequent generations. And psychology is going to take Darwin's ideas and apply them to these mental processes, in addition to physical traits, like his research with finches. Sociocultural approach. So here, your kind of psychological terminology you're going to want to work in are this idea of learned norms. So behaviors and mental processes, they vary across, gender, ethnicity, nationality, economics, socioeconomic status. And there's these kind of learned norms, learned expectations and behaviors that are associated with each of those groups. And also have norms, things like individualistic versus collectivist cultures. So in a collectivist society, the goals and the needs of the community and the group are going to be prioritized potentially over individual. And an individualistic culture, the society is going to stress personal rights and independence, self-reliance, and standing out from the group. And we mentioned the biopsychosocial approach already, but I just kind of want to show you what we mean by the bio piece. That would be your biological and evolutionary approaches or perspectives. The psychological would be cognitive, behavioral, humanistic, and psychodynamic. And then, of course, sociocultural represents the sociocultural perspective. And when you're doing the biopsychosocial approach to explain behaviors or mental processes, which you can see at the center of this image, that's literally the definition of psychology, that you're going to combine to get the best potential picture of really complex behaviors like learning by using all of these different approaches. If you're looking at something like aggression, there can be a variety of things that cause this. So from a humanistic perspective, a lack of unconditional positive regard, or potentially an individual's lower needs are not being met. There could be disturbances in neurochemistry. So low levels of serotonin are correlated to increased aggression. And of course, there's like expectations and norms for how you're supposed to respond that would vary based on your age group, your gender, a variety of other factors, your profession. So again, just to sum them up, here's your 7 theoretical approaches or perspectives. And you can use these to explain psychological disorders, like say anxiety, but also any other type of behavior or mental process. But just again, as a quick review, we did this the other day. If you look at these 7 approaches, can you come up with a name or 2 or possibly 3 that you've learned during the year that would fall under each of these approaches? I'll give you a second to look at that. Okay, here are a few more names that maybe you remember. I added a few more that we didn't talk about during the cognitive approach, like maybe like an Edward Pullman, biological approach, Carl Broca, the individual responsible for finding Broca's area, the area typically in the left frontal lobe that's responsible for the production of language. Carl Wernicke, which is language comprehension, typically in the left temporal lobe. And Roger Sperry with the split brain research and lateralization of function. Okay, a little quick check for understanding with the 7 modern perspectives. So contemporary or current approach only. So don't choose structuralism, functionalism, Gestalt, or psychoanalysis. Okay, let's see how you did. I put these 4 together because there's sometimes these 4 can overlap and be confusing. So sometimes students confuse biological and cognitive. With biological, try to think of it as literally the brain, like the physical organ inside your skull, right, and your nervous system and your nerves. And the cognitive perspective isn't like literally the brain, but it's what the brain does, it's the mind. So with biological, it's the brain, physical organ, and with cognitive, it's what the brain does, the mind. With biological versus evolutionary, you might see genes in either one. So if an individual is vulnerable to an anxiety disorder because they inherited a genetic tendency from their parents, that's biological. The fact that anxiety or altruism or aggression exist in the human gene pool today is because they were naturally selected, because they provided early humans with a survival or reproductive advantage. So hopefully that clears it up. Okay, just a quick debrief of what we covered today. We went over free response questions, general considerations, and showed you how those tie to SOTAs. We covered the 4 historical approaches or schools of thought, and we also went through the 7 contemporary or modern approaches in psychology, which basically should be a big overview for the entire unit. I'm going to leave you with another exam practice. So this one is going to be related to the approaches, and I only gave you 4 of the 7. If you want, level advanced, you can do all 7. But take a look at this particular exam practice, and you're going to want to define each of these approaches and probably start by referencing that definition of psychology and explain Ava's behavior according to that approach using specific psychological terminology associated with that approach. So it's not there, but if you had psychodynamic, you would definitely want to be incorporating unconscious influences. Okay, just want to hit you with another reminder about device and internet access. If you need anything from the College Board, you can take part, you can participate in this survey and help work on solutions for you. Okay, thanks so much for watching. I will be back again Monday, but for the rest of this week, you're going to have the opportunity to study and learn along with Dr. Swope. And I hope you have a really great week, and I will see you next Monday. Take care.